I'm hoping you can hear me.
Again.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today, this morning. We're going to, I'm sure others will join as we get started, but we want to be very conscious of everyone's time. My name is Rosemary Suggs Evans, and I am the director here at the Department of Small Local Business Development. And we are excited to be working with our sister agencies, the Office of Risk Management, in presenting this information today for you all. We wanted to make sure that our CBEs that are currently contracting with the district or are interested in contracting with the district are aware of the insurance standards that will be proposed officially later this fall, I believe. And we wanted to, have this conversation with you all to make sure that you could ask any questions, provide any feedback, any concerns that you may have as it relates to the information that's presented in this PowerPoint presentation shortly. So I want to make sure that you all feel very comfortable with stating good or bad things, but we really, really want your feedback. It's important for us. The only way we can make things better and continue to improve and make it easier and more efficient to do business with the district is hearing your feedback. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Robert to get started on the presentation.
Thank you very much, Director, for the introduction. First of all, can you see the screen, the presentation, and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you, Director Ross. So thank you all for joining today, and I really appreciate DSLBD for putting this together and for us to be able to have this forum to discuss the insurance standards for contracting with the district. With us today, in addition to, of course, our host, DSLBD, we have our Chief Risk Officer, Director Ross, and some of his staff. Hi, Director. And then we also have our sister agency, the Office of Contracting Procurement, representatives here as well. And then part of this initiative also included some other agencies like the Department of Insurance, Securities and Banking, and which is not with us today, and a couple of others. So we just wanted to, again, give this opportunity for you to see what those minimum insurance standards are and get your feedback. And I don't know, Director Ross, before I go further, did you have any comments? Okay, great. We'll move on.
No, welcome, everyone.
All right.
Thank you so much to all our partner agencies.
Thank you. Yeah, so today for this webinar, we'll be focusing on the information technology group. So hopefully you are part of that industry. If not, there are other webinars that DSLBD has set up for more specific industry-related contracts. But if you are IT related, then welcome. You're in the right place. So let me just walk you through some of the agenda items for today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the goal and objective for today and how we plan on achieving that. Give you just a little bit of background as to how we got here today. Provide you with the minimum standard insurance for IT contracting with the district. We'll talk about kind of what we see as next steps. A lot of that will really depend on your engagement and feedback, and then questions and discussion at the end. However, if you do have a question, feel free to, if you know how to raise your hand in the meeting, feel free to do that. Otherwise, it'd probably be best to maybe save your questions to the end, and then we can address them all together. So the goal and objectives for today. So the ultimate goal here is really to support the CBE community to meet insurance requirements in district government contracts. So as you know, when you look at solicitations, you generally section I-8, under that contract, you'll see the list of insurance requirements that are part of your contracting terms and conditions. How are we going to do that? So first, we really wanted to get a better understanding as to what your challenges are with meeting those insurance requirements. That is a big key. We throughout the years, and I've been with the district now for 8 years, all in insurance department here at the Officers Management. We've gotten feedback through our trainings, also during contracting periods, etc. But this is also just another way, another form, if you will, for us to really get your feedback on the challenges you've seen as certainly conditions have changed since the pandemic, and how also our contracting insurance requirements have changed. We also want to provide education and resources to help you meet those needs. And so, that discussion will help flourish, build that out, and then promote transparency and consistency. So as Director Suggs-Evans mentioned, we plan on publishing these in a more formal basis other than just solicitation by solicitation. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how we plan on doing that. So again, how we got here today to this webinar, we really would like to make contracting a little more easier, particularly through transparency. And that, of course, a big part of that are the insurance standards that go along with contracting. Like to hear, as I mentioned earlier, more about CBE's experience with the insurance requirements in contracts. And then we also want to emphasize that these standards are not new. So I've been, again, with the district for about 8 years, working on these insurance requirements. And hopefully what you'll see, especially if you've been contracting with the district for a long time, is that these are not new. We're just working on, again, publishing them, making them more transparent upfront, in addition to, of course, what you see in the solicitations when you look at them case-by-case basis. So that is certainly something that, shouldn't surprise you in terms of what those insurance requirements are. And just another caveat here that these are minimum standards. And so depending on, for example, particularly with IT, if you have a particular data set that you're required to deal with, or if there's a particular system that you'll get access to, then those limits could change based on that information. And that's all laid out in the scope. And then, of course, ultimately translated into the insurance requirements section in I-8. All right, so here's the big chunk of the presentation, and the insurance requirements that, or the insurance standards for contracting with the district with IT-related contracts. What you'll see here is that the insurance requirements are broken out in terms of contract value. This is unusual for us in terms of risk management. However, in speaking with the Office of the Chief Technology Officer and with the contracting folks over at the Office of Contracting Procurement, we have found that for IT at the moment, this is the best way to tackle the insurance requirements for this particular type of contract. Ideally, and the way we're going to move towards, is that eventually, once the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, or OCTO, have assessed the systems in more detail and can provide kind of threat access and levels, then those requirements will be based on that kind of access and data sets, etc. But for the time being, we've broken them up into all IT contracts. Those are the really basic, the minimum of minimums. And then the contracting value from 25,000 to 100,000, from 101,000 to 500,000, and everything over 500,000. Now, I want to emphasize again, just because you might fall under contract value of 25,000 to 100,000, that doesn't mean that those limits that are listed there for those particular types of insurance won't increase. And we're particularly about cyber. Again, it depends on the data set that you have. about what systems you'll be accessing, and all that will be delineated in the scope. So just to walk a little bit through the types of insurance, that first column here on the left side, the 3 standard insurance requirements are, of course, general liability, commercial auto, and workers' compensation. Now, obviously, if your company or if your employees don't use or are not required in the scope to drive a vehicle as part of the contract, then talk with the contracting officer, and most likely the commercial auto should not be applicable. The same thing with the workers' compensation. The district right now requires that if you have 1 or more employees, that you carry workers' compensation coverage. If you don't have any employees and only use contractors, then obviously the workers' compensation would not apply. Employer's liability is part of workers' compensation, so those two actually go hand in hand. And then the excess umbrella limits, as you can see there, they don't change across the board. They're the minimums. And the reason for that is because recently the insurance world, if you will, the insurance industry, the umbrella will not necessarily cover the cyber. However, there are, I don't know if there's a broker online here, but there are excess, which means kind of like layers on top of cyber, that obviously can go above the cyber liability requirement. We will look at those, like if, for example, your insurance broker says, well, we, for example, under the contract value of $25,000 to $100,000 under the cyber liability, there you see the $2 million limit requirement. If for some reason, your broker says, well, we have a $1 million, but we can get an excess layer on cyber for another $1 million. Would that be all right? And yes, that would be fine. So there are different ways to package this. You just need to make sure you have a good insurance broker that that knows your business and knows what it is that you are doing on an annual basis. And then we have so third-party crime. That is because a lot of the cyber liability coverages do not cover theft. So employee theft, for example, we have a lot of contracts that either involve monetary transactions, etc. So we wanted to make sure we covered those kind of incidences. And then professional liability, if the contract requires a certain type of design, for example, then the professional liability would kick in there. There are, as you probably know in your world, there are what's called tech E&O, so errors and omissions policies that kind of combine the cyber and the professional liability, and we are fine with that kind of coverage. We would have to just kind of make sure the limits are okay and that it actually covers what we require. And then sexual abuse molestation. So we do require sometimes for our contractors to go to schools, for example, or treatment centers, or a hospital, for example. And for that, we do require that your organization carries sexual abuse and molestation coverage. Now, I've went into the specifics really quickly. I do want to say that part of what we want to hear from you is, in addition to, like, obviously pricing always comes up, and as a comment, we do want to hear about your challenges for getting these types of coverage, and whether you have the right insurance broker, and what your challenges are in terms of understanding these types of things, etc. Before I answer your question, I see one hand up. Let me just kind of go into the footnotes one more time here. So all the contracts with access to DC government's IT systems, should have a good cybersecurity practice requirement provided by the Office of the Chief Technology Officer. So that will be part of the contract that's published. The limits are based on contract value, as I mentioned earlier. and at some point will probably correspond to access threat levels. And then for contracts that require system design or other professional work will require professional liability or technology errors and emissions policy. And then this sexual abuse molestation will be required for contracts that require installation at locations with vulnerable population. And yes, Keel Chesley.
Yeah, can you hear me
Sorry,
okay? And it's Kyle. It's interesting.
Oh,
way to
Kyle.
spell
Sorry,
Kyle.
apologize. Thank you for correcting.
No worries. I really appreciate first and foremost for this forum. I think it's critical not only for existing businesses, but most critical for new businesses. And I appreciate your candor and the sense that we as the vendors can push back on some of these requirements. I just want to say I've had extreme challenges in pushing back to the contract officer and essentially explaining exactly what you did. For example, a software resale contract for $40,000 does not need to require sexual assault and molestation insurance. And I received significant pushback from the contract officer saying, hey, this is a minimum requirement. You have to have this or you're going to be denied the contract. And it was incumbent on me to escalate that through the channels of Office of Contracts and Procurement. And then it was made clear that this was absolutely not necessary for the requirement. I had to get my broker on a conference call with OCP in order to do so. And a lot of businesses don't have those resources. In the same vein, I, in multiple occasions, had to explain to the contract officer why the contract had absolutely nothing to do with vehicle liability insurance. And we did not need to cover that in order to deliver to the district. And unfortunately, if I didn't have the broker, like you said before, who was a team player and willing to, jump on the phone with these powers that be, I would have had to incur a lot more costs on my insurance in order to, supply or deliver on contracts that I could very well do without these added insurance coverages. And I'll stop really quickly, but one of my biggest concerns is that some of these requirements are put on for contractors at the DC supply schedule level, where there's absolutely no work whatsoever connected immediately to these projects. And a lot of, the verbiage from DSLBD, rightfully so, you need to get certified, you need to jump on a DC supply schedule contract. And these companies with absolutely no revenue, and they've already incurred all this insurance cost, they're asked to incur even additional insurance costs, which they don't even need. So I guess my question is, what are the proper channels that we need to go to as small business owners to push back on the contract officers and say, listen, this is not necessary. This is what we're doing. And we have maintained the insurance requirements that are necessary for fulfilling the contract. And I'll stop there. That's a lot.
Yeah. So, I'm not familiar particularly with the scope that you had mentioned price along with the type of coverage, and generally that doesn't really go hand in hand. It's really what's in the scope. But I think your bottom line point is, what is the process? And I think there's an education question as well for our staff, and we are going to be doing a very intensive insurance training for the contracting officers for the next few months. So by the end of the calendar year, hopefully we'll have covered a big chunk of that. So we do realize, staff change and contracting staff, they're not necessarily insurance experts. So that's why we're here at the Officers Management to help internally consult with them and answer questions. I know that the Office of Contracting Procurement also has, part of this process to make contracting easier. Internally, also revisited and looking at their processes for these types of scenarios. So hopefully by the beginning of next calendar year, you should be able to see less of this occurrence. I'm not going to say that this kind of scenario that you presented, it's not going to happen again. Again, employees change and there are a variety of experts, and there will be some certainly opportunity for you to challenge that as you did and address that in a process that'll be established. But hopefully you will encounter less of that. In terms of the supplies, CC supply schedule, that is a whole nother conversation. And happy to address that in a separate venue. But basically, they also have minimum insurance requirements, and they should be following kind of the same processes. And I see Director Suggs Evans' hands up.
Good morning again, everyone. I just want to say a couple of things because I'm seeing a lot of the questions, comments in the chat. So please keep those coming. We're keeping track of those. But I don't want you all to get frustrated by what we're presenting here. This is your comments and questions are extremely helpful. We will certainly be having conversations after each one of these workshops, information sessions that we're doing. But I just want to reemphasize that this is an opportunity to get your feedback, and then based on your feedback, hopefully we can make some modifications, adjustments to make it easier to do business. We don't want it to be hard for you all to do business with the district. So just keep your comments coming, but please don't get frustrated. That's why we're holding these information sessions and coming to you all first. So thank you.
Director, let me just Mr. Giles.
Yes, good morning. I'm Will Giles. I'm the Deputy Chief Procurement Officer for the Office of Contracting. I was I heard the question from Kyle concerning requirements from the DC supply schedule. And I want to make sure that we capture that question, to take a look at that, to see if something that we're doing with the requirements for the DC supply schedule are out of sync with what the Office of Risk Management is telling us or advising us to do. So just wanted to let you know, and to follow up with Director Suggs, that we'll be taking a look to see if there's something in our practice of the Office of Contracting Procurement which is causing frustration and unnecessary grief for the CBE community. So like Director Suggs said, we will be taking a look after this particular session with this information exchange, to see if there's something that we need to revise in our process.
Yes, Ashanti. Sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Yes. Hi, Will. Maybe you can, OCP can develop a checklist so that based on each particular contract, you could figure out, all right, these are the standard, and then from the additional, is that necessary? Because I think, like Kyle said, these are standard, and I don't think even when we ask the contracting officers, they aren't willing to do it, because it would have to be an amendment. So, if it can be done beforehand, and someone in OCP actually reviews based on the actual requirements of the contract, is this insurance required, and then put it out, then it's easier for us rather than navigating it after the fact. And also some of these insurance requirements are trickle down. So if there is a prime, the prime may have it, but then they force the CBEs to have the trickle down of the same insurance standards, even though we may be doing 1/10 the work.
Yes. Thank you, Shanti. Let me just get the next question here, and then maybe I can answer them at the same time. Kiara?
Yes, good morning. Thank you for hosting this event. This is very helpful. Some insurance requirements are extremely expensive. I'm not talking about the basic ones, but where we're talking about hundreds of dollars a month, where small businesses simply just cannot afford that price tag if there is no contract associated. So, um, one thing that we've tried to push back on is say, hey, we will get this specific insurance in the event that we're awarded the contract, and then of course they respond, we're not going to award if you don't have the insurance. So I don't know what the recommendation is there, but it's just been kind of an ongoing issue, and most importantly, it's very hard to acquire some specific insurances, where we have talked to 15 different brokers, and they have simply said we cannot assist you because you're in contracting or because of the type of work you do. So just any recommendations there, because we're kind of pulling our hair out trying to find this specific type of insurance.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Now, I just wanted to caveat that a lot of what we're doing today is also collecting these kind of questions and concerns and see how we can provide those resources again to you and to your organizations as you contract. So we won't be able to answer all of them, but I'll be able to answer some general questions to those. So Lynette.
Yes, I wanted to piggyback on what that person just said. That particular insurance we're having problem with also is the cyber $10 million. That's the one that's really eating us up in the construction arena where we are just project managers. And we're not actually doing the construction part of it, but we're required as the sub to have the same 10 million that the prime has.
Yeah. All right. Let me just maybe answer the sub question because it comes up here. It obviously comes up also under the construction workshop. I'm sure it will come up there. So in our contract, as you may know, insurance is contractually based. So it applies for when there are contracts between two parties. And so in our contract with, in this case, the general contractor or the prime, we set the insurance requirements and then leave it up to that prime to work with the subcontractors to have either the same insurance requirements or to take on the liability of those subcontractors. Either case, we will be, most likely going after the general contractor's insurance, and then that general contractor prime will have to then see about, what their remediations are to make themselves whole should there be a breach. So for that scenario, yeah, that is the requirement. So that it will leave it up to the prime and the general contractors to then work with their subcontractors to cover the necessary risks that are associated with the contract. In terms of expense, we realize that the expense of insurance has gone up, particularly since the pandemic. We also constantly work with insurance brokers. We work with our also sister agency, the Insurance Securities and Banking, and their forums and their contacts with the insurance companies to see what the reality of the markets are. Ultimately, though, what we really look at is what kind of risks does a contract provide to the district and to you. We look at it twofold. We want to make sure that the people we contract with, particularly our CBE community, stays in business should there be a claim, and realizing that financial resources are tight, that should there be a claim, we want to make sure that you have insurance in place that will cover the expenses that are associated with it. Just one breach could be $3 to $4 million worth of expenses, which my understanding is that most CBEs don't have in the bank to pay out. As somebody who's also has been in with family with their own businesses, I totally understand that those are expenses, and covering those types of claims would not be financially feasible without insurance. Kiara, you had another point?
Yes, just really quick. Two things. One thing I really highly recommend that the prime have to be fully insured and then take on the responsibility of the subcontractors. Like at least given that option, like standard language in any of these contracts that are over 500,000 or a million or whatever makes sense to OCP. But I think that would be very, very helpful for CBEs in particular to be able to compete. And then the second thing is I'll just compare contracting on the state of in the state of Maryland. In the state of Maryland, they will have language saying this is the required insurance for this contract. Show us the insurance that you have now, and in the event that you are awarded, you have 5 days to show proof that you have this insurance. That makes it much easier to be able to compete in these larger contracts without the burden of taking on added expense when you may not even be awarded work. So that's one thing that I've seen on the state of Maryland side that maybe District of Columbia could implement.
Thank you for that, Kiara. Let me just kind of, again, talk about the next steps that we envision in general, and then incorporating a lot of your comments and questions. Certainly, we want to publish those minimum insurance standards so everybody can reference them. We also want to provide additional, continual education about insurance. I know, Kiara, you had mentioned, having gone to brokers, for example, and that kind of goes also to the third point, establish resources to assist with obtaining insurance. So it's a combination of those two. A lot of times we find that insurance companies decline to insure or make it very expensive to insure because they don't feel comfortable, with the risk that's associated with an organization, particularly new organizations that don't have any historical what they call loss runs, any period to kind of show that they've been diligent about their protocols. They also, sometimes it's just a matter of not having the right insurance broker who can brings enough business to an insurance company, and unfortunately that's also relationship based and volume based, and so sometimes they are able to get discounts for their clients. So there's a number of factors that go into pricing and being able to insure it. And sometimes the insurance companies are just, some of them are just at capacity. They don't want to take on any more risk, particularly risk that they're not familiar with in small businesses. So this is all, things that we're looking at. This is all part of what the insurance and securities and banking is also looking at. Yeah, we're taking all those scenarios in consideration. I'm now opening up to other questions and answers, and Kyle, to kind of your initial questions. If you have specific solicitation questions, start with the contracting officer for sure. Then there's also the OCP has the Procurement Center for Excellence, Customer Service Center. They can also contact for just general insurance contracting questions. Feel free to contact the Office of Risk Management. If it, again, deals with a specific solicitation, we will encourage you to set up a call, with the contracting officer, and happy to join those calls along with your broker as well. We've done that in the past. And then just for general, broker questions, insurance questions, just for your business in general, you're also welcome to call the Department of Insurance, Securities and Banking. For licensing in the district, you may be familiar with the Department of Licensing and Consumer Protection. So they have also just licensing insurance requirements, but we're not really talking about that. We're talking today about contracting with the district. So those, you might see those insurance be different because just because you're licensed to work in the district, it's different than actually contracting with district government. And so those insurance requirements will differ. Linda, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this topic with you all, and glad you put this webinar together. I was just curious, how often does DC review these insurance limits, and what's the process for determining? I will say that I echo what other people have said. We've gone from sometimes maybe $1,000 or so dollars, and then when we added cybersecurity, we went to $14,000 a year for our insurance. So, just wondering how you set these limits and how often they're reviewed.
Yeah, the officers management reviews them no less than an annual basis. We do have to some extent weekly, monthly, and quarterly calls with our own insurance brokers who we discuss what the current insurance markets are like and what's difficult, what's not being offered anymore. Like, for example, for nonprofits, there's a whole program in place, Nonprofit Alliance, for example. They used to offer umbrella coverage. They don't anymore, and if they do, it's very limited. Cyber, for example, they don't really cover. Sexual abuse molestation's also been a coverage that they've kind of reduced or eliminated from their program. So we do get that information consistently. Ultimately, what we do, though, have to do as part of the risk management assessment is to see, what is the scope and what is the risk of you as an organization, and us as somebody who's hiring you to do it are exposed to. And should there be a claim by another party, how can everybody stay in business for you to continue providing that service and for us to minimize the cost of the taxpayer dollar. Yes, Herschel.
So I put a few comments. Thank you very much. This has been a pain point for me for years. I've talked to council, I've talked to ORM, so I'm so glad that we're looking at this holistically. The one point I'll make, and I put a few comments in the chat, and I'm welcome to speak to any of you, offline about this. All IT contracts are not the same. Even contracts for services. Unfortunately, most of DC's technology contracts for services are contracts for bodies. They're not perform a statement of work. They're not develop this system. They're not run this help desk. It is give me a developer, give me an administrator. That scope doesn't allow me to have, and we are ISO 20,000, 27,000, we're certified out the yin yang, we have very solid processes. We cannot apply those processes for our DC contracts because our DC contracts for technology are for bodies. We have zero control over them. And as my broker told me, every time I send in these requirements, he's like, what the heck? Why do you need $10 million when you have no control of the people? So what I would really like to see out of ORM and out of this process is an understanding not all technology is the same. If we're providing bodies and they're working at the direction of DC, we have no control. So how are we liable? Or two, please explain to me how we could be liable in these cases. I would really appreciate that out of this process.
Okay. Noted the question. Yeah, I mean, generally, in terms of the insurance requirements, as I mentioned earlier, right now they're based on contract value. What we would like to move towards is to more what you're mentioning, Herschel, and that's to base it more on the access threat levels. That includes data sets, not just access to certain systems. So we're moving towards that. It's just an assessment that we rely on for our sister agency to make. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of different IT contracts and things, and we want to make sure that when we do roll that out based on those levels, that they're as accurate as possible.
hopefully we'll get a chance to comment on that as well. In other words, if Octo, and I love Octo, they're one of my key customers, sharp people over there, but this distinction, we're businesses, they're not businesses. So we understand the distinction of risk and risk management. They're focused on IT. So hopefully whatever they produce, we'll have an opportunity to have a forum like this to talk about it.
We'll note that. Yeah, can't speak on behalf of Octo, but I will make a note of that. All right. Any other challenges that you see? Any resources that you need that you would like to see? This is kind of your time to brainstorm and to think. The presentation at this point, I'm not sure will be shared. Getting back to you, we are, as I mentioned to you before, planning on publishing the insurance standards, excuse me. So that'll be towards beginning of the calendar year. We want to make sure that before we release all this information that we have the right feedback and comments in place in case there are any tweaks that need to be made. So there's no confusion as to multiple kind of information being out there. So this is more of a time for you to present your challenges and resources that you'd like to see, and then we can go from there. Yeah, Lynn.
I thought I read that you all were going to share a list of brokers that we could interview, et cetera, to try to meet these insurance standards. Did I misread that?
It's one of the resources that we're planning on looking at, and so we're pulling all that together. There's been some thought about perhaps establishing one website for all contracting insurance questions and comments and resources. So that's still in the works and discussion. So I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but I think that that's certainly one of the suggestions internally that we've had. And then Kyle kind of spoke to it in his comments about where to go instead of multiple places, maybe just one place. So that's definitely something we're looking at.
And do you all track the number of claims, just to have a sense of how often you're getting molestation claims or cybersecurity claims? Do you all keep track of that?
Well, when we have official claims against the district, we do have a process for that. In terms of contracting themselves, there are various contract mechanisms in place. The Office of Contracting Procurement that do track certain incidences, et cetera. But I don't know if Director Ross or Deputy Director Giles want to comment on that.
Yeah, we definitely we look at that. Obviously, that plays a role, but ultimately, the risk, the exposure to the district, the potential financial loss that Robert and the team are looking at on a monthly, weekly, annual basis with our brokers, what happens in the industry, and previous losses all go into that evaluation. But so none of this is just done willy-nilly by the Office of Risk Management. I can say, when we look at things, we look at them generally 1-over-1, and then we do the analysis to say, based on this risk. So yes, if you don't drive a car, then you theoretically won't need to have automobile insurance. If you aren't having access to to certain things, then there's an you're not around children, then you won't necessarily children or vulnerable populations, then you theoretically wouldn't necessarily need to have sexual abuse coverage. So, but it has to be analyzed in order to be able to make that assessment. So once those future conversations come up with the contracting officers and when the Office of Risk Management gets involved, then we definitely are clear in saying this minimum insurance requirement is not necessary. There's also the evaluation, the goal of this is to be transparent, right? To make sure that the process is clear. And so as you saw those minimum standards, the goal with those minimum standards is there's sometimes that they're going to be greater, right? If all of a sudden, you're working on an IT contract where you have access to all of the district's most critical systems, and the IT contractor makes a failure and it costs the taxpayers $100 million, we're going to have a conversation before the contract is let, before it's awarded, that vendor who's bidding is going to be able to have the highest levels of insurance to make sure that taxpayers aren't going to bear the burden of that cost. But if they're not, controlling a major important system, then they shouldn't necessarily have to have significant, very high dollar insurance requirements. It really should be a 1-over-1 analysis. But the purpose of this is to put out those minimum standards so everyone knows if you're going to be working on a contract scope of this type, that threat, that exposure is going to exist. And if that threat and exposure exists, then this is the type of insurance coverage that you should have. This is the minimum limit, but that limit could go up if it's more significant, that exposure. And so each one of those needs to be evaluated with the contracting officer and with the Office of Risk Management to make sure that it's accurate. The last thing that we want is people to be required to pay for and buy insurance when it's not pertinent. That's not helpful to anybody. That's definitely not helpful to our CBE community. That's not what we want to have happen. I will also say there was earlier a question about buying the insurance before a contract is awarded. I think that it really gets to a competition issue that becomes a significant risk to the OCP process. I don't want to speak for OCP, but as a long-term government employee, the last thing that we want, and all CBEs, all primes, doesn't really matter. The last thing that you want is unfair competition, where somebody will say, oh, I have insurance, they bid on something, they get awarded the contract, but then from a compliance perspective, they never meet those insurance requirements. And then all of a sudden, somebody who bid a little bit higher because they had those costs, those administrative costs, they don't ever get to actually compete fairly. And so it becomes a concern where you're dealing with people who are bidding, who don't have insurance, or they don't have the ability to meet the insurance requirements. And then you award the contract, and all of a sudden you really can't move forward with that contract because they can't meet the compliance rules, whether it's insurance, whether it's a clean hand certificate, whether it's all sorts of other factors of compliance, for source agreement, you name it. We want to ensure that anybody who's proposing to respond to a solicitation, that those individuals are able to then meet the requirements of all the contracts. And so that becomes a concern that we run into, where individuals are after the fact trying to change terms within a solicitation, which is obviously a big no-no. So that becomes a big challenge that we're trying to address as well. So hopefully that answers some of the questions. And I do see there are a significant number of comments and questions being listed in the chat. We are definitely taking note of all of them, and we're definitely tracking them. Herschel, I did note your comment about, as a prime, that your insurance actually does not allow you to take on the risk of some of your subs. And so then your insurance carrier actually may require that the subs have it. Again, building an insurance program for a particular contract is something that happens. It happens regularly, and making sure that the right individuals who are doing the particular work have the right insurance requirements. I agree, and ORM will agree, that if you don't have really control over anything, you're just providing a contractor, for instance, to work at the Office of Chief Technology Office, then you have to meet your employment practices requirements, but you don't necessarily have to meet other ones. But if that individual who is your employee is having access to district government systems, and they could cause a breach or a concern, or they could take data that could impact, all district residents' social security numbers, or whatever it might be, having cyber insurance might actually be applicable, right? And so that's the evaluation and the analysis that it has to take place to make sure that it's accurate, right? That we're not going to want to require insurance standards that are inaccurate. But when there is the risk, and the taxpayers may lose, our residents may lose, your company may lose financially because of those incidents and losses that may occur, we want to make sure that there's insurance behind that so that you don't go out of business, the taxpayers don't have to pay, and the residents aren't harmed. The residents of the district aren't harmed, our constituents, because of that. So, but often, and I think as directors, I think that there are times though, and what we have seen is ultimately the prime contractor is still responsible, right? And so having those high levels of insurance are the best way. How you build that program, it's really determined upon those responding parties to the RFPs, the RFQs, to the IFBs. And in the supply schedule, that is definitely something we've noted it. We will be following up with the Office of Contracting Procurement. Deputy Director Giles just commented on it. We'll make sure that we're working succinctly together. Generally, the 3 historic standard insurance requirements are general liability, auto, and then of course, workers' compensation, which are pretty much standard. If you're going to be driving a vehicle, if you're going to, if you have more than 2 or more staff, you need workers' compensation, and then general liability. Those are really just like truly basic. Now, if you're not driving a vehicle, and especially in the IT world, that can be the case if you're doing everything remotely, then that is a conversation where it wouldn't and doesn't need to be required. And ORM often will work with OCP about that when we have clarity that there's no vehicles working in a capacity to support DC government business. So we will definitely follow up on that. I'll turn it back to you, Robert. I don't see any other hands at the moment being raised, but we will continue to work. I see Ashanti has raised her hand, so please go ahead, and I'll turn it back over to Robert.
Hi, I did have one quick question. So the sexual abuse and all those, when do those go into effect? I know in the health and human services sector, that's required. But in general, is that now going to be required for everyone?
It's required, if you see this last footnote on the slide I'm showing, for contracts that require installation at locations with vulnerable populations.
So like DC, if you go to DCPS and you're an IT technician, it would be required.
That's
or yeah, okay, hospital or any, okay.
And as you mentioned, health and human services, like we
right.
If you go to like St. Elizabeth's, for example, or some treatment center. Exactly.
Then you would need it. That's okay.
Yeah. So these are, again, this chart that I'm showing, this will be again published. There are these footnotes, and that's what I was relating to. So the sexual abuse molestation, even though it's part of the chart, there's a caveat to that, and that footnote is basically for installation of locations with vulnerable populations. Or if you have to be on site, not necessarily installation, but if you if you're monitoring somebody, if you're on site, basically. Well, I don't want to belabor the meeting. I know we have time till 11 scheduled for this, just to give you an opportunity to ask more questions or provide some ideas as to resources that would be helpful for you. This chat will be open, I think, for a little bit. So feel free to insert any more of your questions or comments or suggestions. Happy to have them. Again, you have our contact information. You certainly have DSLBDs. But again, for specific solicitation, I really encourage you currently to go to the contracting officer for that particular solicitation. For general contracting questions, there's that Center for Excellence that OCP provides. And then for any general questions for contracting, feel free to contact us at ORM, or general insurance questions, brokers, etc. Feel free to contact the Department of Insurance, Securities and Banking, or DSB. Thank you again for DSLBD for hosting this, and for all of you who participated. This has been helpful, certainly for me, and I think for our sister agencies. Your questions are definitely insightful, and certainly your concerns are noted, and we will do our best to address those, to provide the resources that you need to continue contracting with the district. And in terms of insurance. Right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.